Okay, so got this kind of weird title, Irrigated Eden and the Charmed Goose. That portion will become apparent as we go through. That looks fine, Doug. So a thematic history of water and fisheries management in the Upper Snake River Basin. I'll see if I can do justice to this topic. And I've been thinking for about 6 weeks, how am I going to present this information? And it failed me until I went back to our conceptual diagram that's in the centerpiece, and this is maybe the third time this has appeared on the screen here so far this semester. And so here's, as soon as I looked at this, it occurred to me exactly how to do this, and so I'm going to attempt to do it like this. Links D and F between the watershed scale human dimensions and the two respective hydrologic and ecological systems will be water management on the left, fisheries management on the right. Those are the two things I'm going to choose to look at there. The linkage between those two, of course, is hydrologic regime. Most of us are familiar with that linkage and why that's so important. As for the macro inputs, on the left, the macro geoscience context that links all this is the Eastern Snake Plain Aquifer, which I'll describe in some detail here in a minute. And the macro ecological context I'm going to explore is invasion of non-native species. And this will be specific to trout because those are the fisheries resources that I worked with up there. So, but that's the macro ecological context. The macro social context, I'll bring in a bunch of different things, but the thematic one that's going to link all this is the dominant natural resource management paradigms that have existed throughout this history that I'm going to present. So I think I got all the linkages there, and I'll have one gratuitous slide later of the field scale just to prove that we actually went out and measured something. Other than that, I'm going to be real light on the graphs and the figures. So my approach is to use that theme of dominant societal view of natural resource management to approach this sort of parallel but integrated history of water and fisheries management, and I'm going to simplify and idealize. So there's an exception to everything I say, and everybody can argue, but that's not true everywhere, and that's certainly true. But I want to keep this as simple as possible to see if we can use this conceptual linkage diagram to actually tell the story and get the answer at the end that we want. So I'm going to emphasize the story rather than the details, and the details are all in a bunch of literature citations that are at the end. I won't project that, but it's in the file, so Doug, when you put it on the website, if you want the actual data that went behind most of this, it's in there. Goose that laid the golden egg, I hope everybody's familiar with that parable. We'll get to that later, and I'm going to put a new twist on that and end with some recommendations to avoid further unintended consequences for water and fisheries management in the face of two issues we're facing in the Snake River Basin, and they're the same issues that we're facing everywhere in the West. One is loss of native species, and the other is expansion of suburban and exurban development out onto formerly irrigated land. So I'm going to at least give you a few conclusions and recommendations. So here's the study area, Upper Snake River Basin, headwaters of the Snake River up here at the southern end of Yellowstone National Park, and the main Snake River goes through Jackson Hole, Palisades Reservoir, on down across the Snake River Plain. The bottom of the study area is actually a USGS gauge at King Hill, which is right downstream of Hagerman down in the Magic Valley. And this is a huge area. It's about 30,000 square miles of drainage. But I've got two nested subbasins in there that I've studied at more detail. One is the Henry's Fork, or North Fork of the Snake River watershed up in the very corner of Idaho where it meets Montana and Wyoming, and that's about a tenth of the full watershed at about 3,000 square miles. And then I'll show you an example from Teton Valley, which is just over the hill from Jackson, Wyoming, and that's about 300 square miles. So everything I've seen here, I've seen reflected at all three of these spatial scales, and I think the results do scale up and down as you look across the whole study area. So a central component here, this is my macro geoscience context, is the Eastern Snake Plain Aquifer, which is about a third of the land area of the total basin. So about 10,000 square miles is the Snake Plain Aquifer. Here it covers most of eastern Idaho. The primary flow is from the high elevations in the northeast towards the southwest. And there are two primary flow pathways, one that sort of angles off here and discharges to American Falls Reservoir and the Snake River in the what we call the Blackfoot to Neely Reach. It's a big gaining reach. They happen to build the reservoir right in the middle of that gaining reach. And the other more major flow pathway is the one that stays sort of on the north side of the aquifer and discharges at Thousand Springs. A lot of you are probably familiar with that, a huge spring complex down near Hagerman. And I'll give you some figures here in a second about the magnitude. So there's the aquifer. It's huge, and a lot of water moves through it. Here's the sort of mean water budget for the aquifer, and the thing I want to call your attention to right here is the primary recharge component is seepage from irrigation. Almost 2/3 of the recharge comes from irrigation, the rest of it from some combination of tributary underflow and river losses and direct precipitation. So we've got this aquifer primarily recharged by seepage from irrigation. I'm glad Chris Neal gave the first talk of the seminar series here on irrigation seepage, so it saves me from giving a talk on that. The outflow, about that same 4 million acre feet, discharges at Thousand Springs. This is a huge spring complex. And then here's the discharge in that Blackfoot to Neely Reach I mentioned. There's some pumping over the last 50 years on net annual basis. We've been pumping about 200,000 acre feet out of the aquifer, so it's declined substantially in storage since about the mid-1950s. So huge aquifer moves a ton of water, and irrigation is the primary driver right now of hydraulic gradients and flow. Here's the surface system. Here's the old Bureau of Reclamation teacup diagram for that system. Again, I mentioned it's about 35,000 square miles. The irrigated acreage is about 2.4 million acres. There are 9 major storage reservoirs with a capacity of 4 million acre feet. If you count reservoirs on here, you'll count 10. One of them doesn't count towards storage. It's this one at the very bottom, Milner, which is essentially a diversion structure. It doesn't count towards the storage. It's just a big dam to get water out of the river and into the 2 very large canals at the bottom of the system. The big reservoirs are American Falls, Palisades, and Jackson. Each of those are around 1 million acre feet, and then the rest of it all adds up to the other 1 million acre feet. So that's the surface system. And that water budget on the whole, it's huge. It's about 11 million acre feet total surface water production in the basin. 10 million of which in some form or another get diverted or pumped or something. I mean, it's essentially all extracted. And what's amazing about it is when you go down to the gauge at King Hill, where you get the complete water budget back together down there because the aquifer is completely discharged and we're back into the river system, a surprisingly small amount actually got used in irrigation. The efficiency is like 40% or less, which is just amazing that we can withdraw 10 million acre feet and only use 4. But that's because the canal system is all earthen, unlined canals, and they're very, very long because they move water tens of miles from the point of diversion to the field. So there's an awful lot of surface area tied up in canals, and they just lose a lot of water, and that goes back into the aquifer for the most part. So I'm going to start the history here. This should look familiar to anybody who's studied the history of the western United States. Euro-American settlement period from what I defined as 1865 and 1910. I've bracketed this by 1865, which is actually the earliest claimed, adjudicated, decreed water right in the Upper Snake Basin. It's 1865. It's in Marsh Valley, just across the Idaho-Utah border up south of Pocatello. That's the earliest one. And then I cut this one off at 1910, which was the date when the Bureau of Reclamation got involved in building big projects in that part of the country. Jackson Dam had been built previously by a private irrigation company, and it failed, and the Bureau came in and built a bigger one, and that one failed, and then they built a bigger one, and finally they got one to stick about 1918 by the time they got the last one done. The natural resource paradigm, again, very simplistic, but I think most of us would not have too much heartburn with the definition of this one. lots of natural resources available. Let's develop them. Let's use them. Water management. What water management there was, it was basically just homesteading, free-for-all, claim water. There's a lot of unallocated water, available land. It's a semi-arid to arid climate, so it requires irrigation. So the actions, of course, were to build canals, divert water, claim water rights, and that's primarily what happened during this settlement period. The consequences of that, of course, reduced stream flow and sort of the beginning of a very long history of decline in aquatic habitats. Fisheries-wise, of course, there's lots of fish around, abundant native trout, and actually the first thing that happened with fisheries is people actually had commercial harvest operations, and they were not aquaculture. This is actually just going out into lakes and streams and harvesting primarily during spawning runs, native cutthroat trout in enormous numbers, just right out of the systems. But there were other people, even as early as the 1880s, who realized the recreational angling opportunities, and people were fishing guides back in the 1880s, and they were guiding people from the East Coast and promoting fishing in this part of the world. And believe it or not, as early as 1900, there were people marketing recreational fishing to the urban dwellers of Salt Lake City. At that point, Salt Lake City was already an established, thriving urban population by the turn of the 20th century, and there was a huge market for outdoor recreation, and a lot of it was centered on the Upper Snake Basin. In consequence of all that, both the water management and the fisheries management action, of course, was the beginning of what's been a long decline in native trout populations. So my sort of next phase that I define here is what I call reclamation phase 1, from 1910 up to World War II, and just put a break at World War II because there were a lot of reclamation projects in the pipeline before the war that got deferred later on and sort of extended the period of big dam building beyond what it might have been had the war not come along. The natural resource paradigm, again, broad generalizations, but I think by this point in time there was somewhat of a quote-unquote conservation ethic in the sense of Teddy Roosevelt. In other words, wise use, wise management, conservation. We can't let all this water flow down the river unused. There's ways to store it and use it more wisely than it had been in the past. So water managers actually by 1910 found themselves in the situation where all of the natural flow had been allocated. All the water rights were claimed. That was already done by 1910. My notation here is brackets are consequences of the previous management actions. And as we go along, more and more of the conditions experienced are bracketed as we go along here. So the Reclamation Act came along and federal government came in to build storage reservoirs, and it was the first time there was a large government presence in this reclamation of Eden from the desert. And I use the Eden from Irrigated Eden, the book, and I understand that Mark was here, gave a talk a few years ago, so maybe some of you remember that. Yeah. So I stole that from his book, but there it is, Irrigated Eden, and it's about the history of irrigation in the Snake River Basin. So the consequences now with some increased storage actually provided more water available for diversion. And so irrigation was greatly expanded because there was now storage in the storage reservoirs, which allowed the water supply to last later on in the summer. And so the diversion rate increased, irrigation acreage increased. And what happened throughout this period between about the turn of the 20th century and World War II was a huge increase in aquifer recharge. So if we're looking at 4 million acre feet recharge in a year now, this is under sprinkler irrigation with the canal system. Back then it was all direct surface application flooding and other methods. So there was an additional couple million acre feet. So maybe the aquifer was being recharged 5 or 6 million acre feet a year due to irrigation during this time. As a result of that, it began to change stream flow regimes from the classical snowmelt runoff dominated regime with a big high peak in the early summer, midsummer, coinciding with snowmelt, to hydrologic regimes dominated by groundwater. And it's sort of two components. One is the physical removal of the flood peak from the dams themselves, which made the peaks a lot lower. And then the other part of that was all this return flow coming in towards the end of irrigation season throughout the winter that increased the base flow, so that despite storage, a lot of stream reaches had more water in them in the winter because of irrigation return. So it made a much flatter hydrograph on these river systems than what had been there under the snowmelt regime. And so the whole thing shifted from being runoff dominated to being groundwater dominated. So declining native trout, that one goes in every one of these slides. No matter what happens, native trout decline. There's no way, that's a one-way street so far. Fisheries management agencies did end commercial harvest pretty quickly once there was a state government to do it, in Idaho anyway. And the solution to declining trout populations was, of course, build hatcheries and stock trout. And the species that were stocked were non-natives. They started in on that pretty early. Rainbow trout for the most part, but brook trout were also stocked. So that resulted in an increase in catchable numbers of fish for anglers, but further decline in the natives, because now not only are they being harvested, but they're facing competition and hybridization from the non-natives. After the war, phase 2 got underway. There was a few more big reservoir projects, and I just put 1976 as the end of this period because that's the last big Bureau project that was built in the Upper Snake Basin, and it was Teton Dam, which failed right as it was being built. It was the first spring it was filling, it failed, so it never actually did store any water or anything like that. The natural resource management paradigm post-war, you could characterize it as sort of the same wise use, sort of, but there was a much greater emphasis on the use of science and technology in doing it. After the war, there was all kinds of new technology and things available to the water managers, farmers, and fisheries managers that weren't there prior to the war. Water management-wise, of course, one thing that they found themselves suddenly faced with was a good thing. There was suddenly all this groundwater everywhere, the water just right under the surface of the ground from all this previous 50 years of flood irrigation. And now they had lots of cheap electricity left over after the Second World War because of all the hydro system development that went on the Lower Snake and the Columbia Basin right prior to the war, and ran the aluminum industry in Seattle and won the war arguably and all that sort of stuff. But now they got all this cheap electricity. Why not sell it to farmers or give it to farmers? What the heck? And along with that, pumps that could pump water out of the ground. But even with that, the pumps didn't need to be all that big because the water wasn't very far below the ground surface in most cases. So you put that in there with finishing some dams and pumping groundwater. That, again, allowed another big expansion of irrigated acreage that occurred right after the war. There were people, returning war veterans, who homesteaded in the 1950s with new water rights that were provided by completing Palisades Dam on the South Fork, and with groundwater. You could pump groundwater now and irrigate things you couldn't irrigate prior to the war. Another interesting thing happened is that a huge aquaculture industry grew up on the Thousand Springs discharge, and this is really a technical issue. They claimed surface water rights on that water because it had just emerged from the aquifer. I mean, this literally, has anybody been to Hagerman and seen this stuff? There's just literally water pouring outside of the basalt wall there. And the aquaculture farm, the fish farm, sit right at the base of the canyon rim, literally taking that water as it's coming out of the ground, but it's surface water at that point, so they have surface water rights on that. It's not groundwater drilling permits, it's surface water rights on water that's coming right out of the aquifer. And of course, there was so much of it, it was a great place for aquaculture. Most people don't know that not only does Idaho produce 75% of the potato crop in the United States, but also 75% of the culinary rainbow trout. So you go to the supermarket and buy trout, and it was raised in Hagerman on groundwater that got in the Snake Plain Aquifer from irrigation upstream. So consequences here, groundwater levels started to decline right out in about mid-1950s, and they've been declining ever since. Fisheries-wise, was a very interesting time in fisheries management. Suddenly, there's all this new habitat. There's all these new reservoirs, and I don't know if you know anything about reservoirs, but when they're first built, they're incredibly productive. You got all these nutrients that are sitting there on the land, and you build a reservoir, and you've got this incredible productivity for about the first, depends on the location and geography, but 10 or 20 years, you got the incredible productivity out of these reservoirs. And then you got all these new spring creeks and all this new wetland stuff. You got a lot of new habitats and a lot more anglers. After the war, people had leisure time and a lot of money, and things were great. Economy was great. People wanted to go fishing. So fisheries managers responded to those increasing angler demands, and, well, what did they do? They stocked even more fish, and they're non-natives. And I could write down again that natives continued to decline. But one of the things that did happen during this time period is that stocking all of these large numbers of hatchery fish sort of masked large-scale habitat degradation and alteration that was occurring all through this time. And I think as long as the fishing was good, nobody really paid much attention to the rest. So then we sort of get into the modern environmental protection conservation era, with a heavy federal influence. We all know about, the period of time in the, mid to late 60s through the early to mid 90s, and it was one federal act after another, Clean Water Act and NEPA and Federal Land Policy Management Act, and all these other things that the feds were handing down that required all this new view of conservation. This is the first time now it's been over 100 years that finally the water use, or at least our ability to divert and apply water, exceeded the supply. That had not happened prior to this time. All that extra diverted water was just being stored in the Snake Plain Aquifer, so they were sort of saving water from previous generations of agriculture in the aquifer. But now that we had pumps, we finally were reducing the net supply at this point. Decreased groundwater levels occurred everywhere. And then, of course, if you've studied the climatology here, you know that 1977 was a very severe drought year. There was a whole series in the late 80s and another bunch in the early 90s. And so that was something that water managers faced. So, of course, the response was, well, we've got to increase irrigation efficiency. And so almost all the flood application, surface application, was switched to sprinklers with big, USDA programs to get all the farmers to be more efficient with their irrigation. I estimate now there's about, say, 10% of the irrigated acreage left is in some kind of surface application, and the other 90% is sprinklers. So the Idaho Department of Water Resources put a moratorium on groundwater pumping for irrigators. They said no more, and I don't remember exactly the year, but it was in the early 70s, and they said moratorium, no more, in fact, no more municipal wells, no more irrigation development off the groundwater, but this will become important in a minute. Single home domestic use was accepted, so anybody can still build a house and drill a well anywhere for single home use, domestic use. So consequences of this, of course, further decline in groundwater, because now that irrigation was more quote-unquote efficient, there was a lot less seepage going in, and that created a big conflict between the groundwater users and surface water users. And I'll come back to this bottom conflict in a minute. Meanwhile, fisheries managers were now facing habitat of all types that was degraded. The original stuff was degraded. The reservoirs now were no longer productive. And non-natives continued, natives continued to decline, but non-native fish were declining now as well. So now we've seen the sort of the habitat caught up with this stocking. And at the same time, fisheries management agencies were getting a lot less money to continue stocking programs. So the fisheries management community went through this period of changing its viewpoint to managing wild trout based on natural reproduction versus supporting everything with hatcheries, got into the habitat restoration business. This is in there when the minimum flow concept was developed. And of course, that did a couple things. One was created this big new constituency for the wild trout experience. And it took angling from a harvest-oriented activity to a recreational activity where people engaged in it for the sport, for the outdoor experience, to be in the natural, quote-unquote, environment, catch fish, release fish. So that created a conflict between the sort of anglers that were brought up under harvest lots of stocked fish and the anglers who wanted this more natural wild trout experience. But then, of course, the biggest thing that happened then was conflict between environmental groups, conservation, fisheries interests, and water users. And that, at least in our part of the basin, resulted in formation of one of the earlier collaborative watershed groups, the Henry's Fork Watershed Council in 1993. That's one reason I use 93 as a bracket on this time period. So when I first did all this, I wrote a paper that I researched all in the mid-90s on history of fisheries management, and this is where I ended that paper. So then what's happened since then is something that back then I wasn't prepared for, which is now what's happened since then in 2008. And you can definitely put a bracket on this based on the economy. And this is a period I call resettlement. And this graphic is a cumulative area of subdivisions platted in agricultural regions of the Henry's Fork watershed. And you can see pretty flat throughout the 80s, and the dot-com boom started, and there was this huge upswing in subdivision of agricultural lands for development. Most of it is in Teton County. I pointed out that little sub-basin of the sub-basin. That's Teton Valley. It's right over the hill from Jackson, Wyoming, and in fact, people who used to work in Jackson, Wyoming can't afford to live in Jackson, Wyoming, so they all built houses over on the Teton Valley side, so we get this spillover from Jackson. But anyway, this is what I call resettlement, which was a new wave of immigration and a resettling of this area. And it's happened not just in Teton Valley, but it's happened in Idaho Falls and in Pocatello and in Rexburg and in Boise and in Twin Falls, and it's happened here on the Wasatch Front, and we're familiar with this. So the natural resource management paradigm throughout this period was a period of collaboration, partly forced collaboration, but also an attempt at getting some local control back from the sort of heavy federal influence of the 70s and 80s. So now you can notice that the conditions are all bracketed. Just about everything we face at this point is some consequence of things that were done for the previous. Lots of conflict, more groundwater decline. Meanwhile, fisheries managers had managed to make some strides in recovering non-natives, and the non-native populations were going up, and fishing's great in most cases. But now the natives, it's not just that they're declining, they're just plain out facing extinction at this point. But one thing that affected both communities, both sides of the history here at the same time, was greatly increased value of fishing and river-related recreation. So these resettlers, as I call them, who are moving there for the natural resource amenities, for the recreation. Study that Loomis, is it John? Is that his name? Colorado State, big natural resource economist, came up and valued the Upper Snake fishery, and this is just the Jackson Hole area, South Fork fishery above Idaho Falls and Henry's Fork, at $150 million a year to the economy, and that's now on the same order of magnitude as the value of agriculture, irrigated agriculture in that part of the world. So action-wise, on the waterfront, the states finally started to move towards conjunctive management of surface and groundwater resources. But at the local, sort of the plot scale, farmers, a lot of farmers in a lot of areas just decided that, the land was more valuable to just sell it because there were so many people wanting to move there for all the recreational amenities that dealing with drought, dealing with conflicts between groundwater and surface water users just wasn't worth it, and they just sold it. Fisheries managers on that side, as the sort of government influence waned, the influence of non-governmental organizations grew. Trout Unlimited, the Nature Conservancy, and other regional and local groups. And a large percentage of their membership are the same people I term as the resettlers. They're the people who are moving there for fishing, hunting, outdoor recreation activities. Water managers and fisheries managers both, and these NGOs, have worked together in many cases to implement some flow and habitat restoration for the non-native, or for the, to recover native species. A lot of it's motivated simply to prevent Endangered Species Act listings and the result of that. But nonetheless, whatever the motivation was, there has been a substantial amount of collaborative action to try and prevent further native species loss. One of the conflicts that occurred in the fisheries management side there was now we pretty much have lost the constituency of harvest-oriented angling, from the 50s, 60s, 70s. Everybody's into catch and release. Well, we trained them so well into catch and release. Now we tell them, well, in fact, we want you to kill the non-natives so they don't compete with the natives. So now we've got this conflict going on between sort of the wild trout advocates and the native trout advocates. Consequences on the water management side, this is my question mark. I don't know. Killing the goose that laid the golden egg. So what do I mean by that? So let's take a look at that. In 2005, I read a paper by Chuck Preston, who runs, I don't know if he still does, but he runs the Draper Museum of Natural History in Cody, Wyoming. Has anybody been over there? It's a incredible museum, great experience. Go over there and go to that museum. It's just fantastic. But anyway, he wrote this article in Yellowstone Science, Saving the Charmed Goose. So the parable is the goose lays golden eggs, and the villagers think this is so great, and they want to learn how come this goose can lay golden eggs, but they had to kill the goose to figure out what internal workings made it lay golden eggs, and then it was dead and didn't lay any golden eggs anymore. So Chuck's article was all about development in Greater Yellowstone. People are moving into this region for the natural amenities, but this is what it looks like now. This is the southern end of Teton Valley. That's what it looks like right now. And much of the Gallatin Valley looks this way, and much of Jackson Hole all looks this way and worse. Cody, all of it. So people who want to move there for the sort of natural environment experience, this is what they're creating. It doesn't take much imagination to figure out what was in Chuck's article, but I immediately invited him to come give a talk at the Watershed Council, Henry's Fork Watershed Council, about this issue. So then I realized in the last couple years that, the environment we're looking at is not natural to begin with. The environment that we're looking at is a product largely of irrigated agriculture. That's not true necessarily right up in the public land areas of Greater Yellowstone, but everywhere in the private land areas, it has been completely shaped by agriculture. These are pictures of this is the main South Fork of the Snake River, the most popular fishing stretch there, and it's just surrounded by irrigated fields. This is a spring creek, irrigated dependent spring creek in Teton Valley. Here you can see a little wetland draw through the middle of a barley field. Non-native fish. This is right below a big canal diversion. This is the environment that we have. It's not natural. It's a product of 120 years of irrigated agriculture. So my twist on this is not development versus a natural environment. It's development versus this irrigated Eden that has been evolving as a result of irrigated agriculture. And so this is my current study funded by the Department of Agriculture. They were interested enough in this to fund a big project. Will replacement of irrigated agricultural land by suburban subdivisions destroy the resources that the people who are moving there actually value in the first place? Same thing as Chuck's article on the golden egg goose here, only it's not the natural environment, it's the irrigated environment. And this picture down here, it's hard to see, but this is the edge of the irrigated land along the lower Henry's Fork, and beyond it is desert. That's what was there before. And I would wager a guess that most people who come to move to Rexburg or Idaho Falls or Twin Falls or Boise or Teton Valley would probably not be nearly as likely to want to live there if it were all desert to begin with. But they're used to seeing this lush, verdant landscape with lots of water everywhere. There's canals and ponds and wetlands, and it's all because of irrigated agriculture. One of the things about resources that these newcomers and these developments need is water. All of the domestic water is supplied by groundwater there. And so there's a moratorium on drilling new municipal water wells. Cities can't drill new wells unless they've already got a permit a long time ago to do it and just haven't drilled it yet. So all of these subdivisions have single homeowner domestic wells because the water law allows that. That's an exemption under the moratorium. Well, if you've got groundwater that's 20 feet under there, that's an easy solution. You drill a shallow well and you got water. But as irrigated agriculture is lost, that water table, that's the source of that water. It's going to continue to decline. Homeowners are going to have to drill wells deeper and deeper and deeper, and the more homes there are, the deeper they're going to have to dig because they're replacing the irrigation system that actually puts the water there in the first place. And then the last piece of that is I think a lot of most people who come there for fish and wildlife, wetlands, and see all this great stuff don't realize that it's largely a product of irrigated agriculture. And there's a lot of other ecosystem services, water quality and extra water storage that accrue to society as a result of this that people just aren't aware of. Here's my only 2 slides with data. It's a GIS analysis. The red is subdivisions on irrigable lands. The green is irrigated landscape, and this is in the southern part of the Henry's Fork watershed. And you can see that at least, especially in Teton County, it's a non-trivial amount of development that's on the irrigated land. We're not talking about a couple subdivisions here and there. We're talking about, in some areas approaching half the irrigated land in some of these sub-watersheds is now platted for subdivision. It's not being irrigated anymore. So this is a non-trivial issue. If we did this analysis in the Treasure Valley around Boise, we would see almost no irrigated land left and the whole thing covered in red. Here's our gratuitous field scale measurement slide of my graduate students in irrigation canals measuring canal seepage. And here's a typical water budget for one of our canal systems up there. The important piece being this one right here, about a third of the water. And this is under sprinkler application. This is under the current sort of efficient system. The canal system's still recharging a third of the water diverted into the groundwater. So conclusions. First of all, I was pleased with how well tying these things together with the theme made me realize how parallel water management, fisheries management were historically, and it makes you really realize that, the loss of native trout species is due as much to the fisheries management actions that were taken throughout the first, 2/3 of the 20th century as to agriculture. And it's been, over this 1970s through 90s period, it's always been sort of fish versus agriculture and fishermen blaming irrigators for the lousy fishing or whatever it was. And you realize, no, it's just as much a product of how fisheries managers manage fisheries. Meanwhile, it's the same thing with the irrigators. The surface water irrigators like to blame the groundwater irrigators for pumping and vice versa and all this, but when you come down to it, the larger community has gotten itself into that situation by making decisions about how to apply and deliver water, and they inherited the problem from themselves. I think there's a lot of parallels there. What we're faced with now is the canal system remains as the largest source of aquifer recharge. We're pretty darn efficient now with the application side, sprinklers and all that. So it's the canal system that's left to recharge the aquifer. And the ecosystem services that are provided by that seeped groundwater and the wetlands are, I think, very poorly understood. I think they're not acknowledged, certainly not appreciated by most people. Now, I've got to point out, and I know this well, these systems aren't what was there 200 years ago. They don't support the same species. They're non-native. They weren't what was there, but they've been there for a long time now, and they provide a lot of valued resources. further loss of irrigated land to development threatens those resources. Recommendations, well, one of them, of course, is, self-serving research scientist. Where can I go get the next grant? What do I need to do next? Well, here's that. I think inventorying and understanding these systems is a critical thing that we need to do next. I hope it's something that this group and what may come out of this in terms of grant might address that. Certainly, I don't have to tell anybody here that you've got plenty of that in northern Utah, irrigation-dependent wetland communities. So Jack had to leave. Here was the line for Jack. I put this in here hoping he'd be here. Expend our precious native species restoration resources only where they're likely to succeed. And the irony of that is below big federal dams where we can actually, people like Jack can turn cranks and try to restore some pieces of hydrologic regime. It's really hard to do if you don't have a storage reservoir, because then you're talking about changing irrigation practices and waiting 20 or 30 years for the aquifer to respond and all this sort of stuff. So there's my one for Jack. And where we don't think we can be very successful or at least efficient in our expenditure and our attempts to restore these native trout species in particular is just, hey, acknowledge the value of and protect the non-native ecosystems we have where they function and provide all these surfaces, and say, hey, the train left the station a long time ago, and let's focus on keeping the resources that we do have and the ecological functionality of those resources. Specific to development, build developments around the canal system. Use the canal system as the landscaping, as features that people want to have a canal in front of their house. But whatever you do, keep the canals viable and continue to irrigate from those canals. Deliver a lot of those canals and just switch the water application from crops that used to be grown on that land, put them on the landscaping, and just keep the canal system functioning in the same way, and restrict groundwater to culinary use only. And there's actually one of the counties, Madison County, the one that Rexburg is in, has adopted an ordinance to this effect, and they won't let new subdivisions put irrigation systems in that are tied to the culinary system. They require that to come from the surface irrigation system, and they limit. So they have actually dual water systems. They got one that's tied into the groundwater, the city's water system in Rexburg, and the irrigation's got to come from the surface water system that's delivered in canals. And this summer, we actually had a field trip with stakeholders that my team on this USDA project put together, and we were sitting around in Teton Valley, and one of the old-time irrigators was telling us how he runs his canal company. And suddenly it dawned on me how to do this, because he described the system they have. They keep the water rights in the canal companies. The canal companies, at least up there, hold the majority of water rights, not individuals. It's canal companies. And he says when farmers sell and people come in and buy homes, he said they don't give the rights away. They just redistribute shares, which entitle those shareholders to do some irrigation, but they don't let the water rights out of the hands of the canal company. And what that does is ensures that the water rights will be managed by the canal company, who will continue to maintain and run the canal system. I think if the model were to let the water rights in the hands of the developers or the new homeowners, eventually there would be no way to keep the canal system running, and eventually that would just disappear. And this, he described this mechanism to us and how it works, and it seems like it's got a lot of potential to minimize further unintended consequences that could be associated with abandoning the canal system as development comes in. So we actually did learn something in this project, and that's that there is a mechanism, at least in Idaho, for doing this, so that the canals stay viable and it's not nearly as vulnerable to the whims of homeowners or developers or whoever moves in. And here's a good picture of, here's canal systems. These are all canals running everywhere out here. And here's a subdivision being built just right around the canal system. And this is in Madison County. So this is a subdivision that'll be held accountable under this new ordinance. They've got to irrigate their lawns out of the canal system. They can't do it with the groundwater. And then here's your irrigation-dependent wetlands and so on. That picture's got lots of great stuff. So that's my attempt at using our little diagram that's in our grant proposal, filling in some pieces and oversimplifying a story to fit in there, but it fit reasonably well. And with that, I should acknowledge some of my major funders over the years and work on this. This has been, 15 years of research summarized in 45 minutes. So I appreciate the opportunity to think about this a little bit more and put it together for you. And I do have the last slides full of the literature citations. Too small of a font to display here, but it'll be on the website. And I left some time for some discussion. Hopefully, I tried hard to do that.